No, the title is not an exaggeration, though I wish it was. The EU may very well destroy the internet as we know it, and we've got less than 1 month to act on this. Over the past few years, independent journalists and alternative media companies have faced the ongoing threats of heavy-handed government regulation of the web. This has included nebulous hate speech laws and clampdowns on what biased social media platforms subjectively determine to be fake news. Well, it's about to get a whole lot more difficult when it comes to the issue of copyright. What I'm about to discuss with you next is the biggest, most disturbing threat to free speech and the free press, and indeed creativity, the internet has ever faced. It's so bad that if this new legislation is allowed to pass, the video you're watching would be impossible for me to make. From edori.org, EU member states agree on monitoring and filtering of internet uploads. On the 25th of May, the European Council agreed to a negotiating position on the draft copyright directive. This will allow the presidency of the Council to start negotiations with the European Parliament on mass monitoring and filtering of internet uploads and a chaotic new ancillary copyright measure that will make it harder to link to and quote news sources. In other words, only large media companies and the mainstream media will be able to report on the news, as they will be the only ones capable of paying the insane fees required to simply link to another website or source. This is farcical and unworkable, despite a large number of demands from a wide range of different stakeholders, including EDRI and Copyright for Creativity, to keep working on the text in order to create some semblance of balance. The Council decided to finalise its position with a flawed text. Now it's the turn of the European Parliament to adopt its negotiating position. The Legal Affairs Committee of the European Parliament is voting on the 20th and 21st of June to agree on their standpoint. There is still time to act to prevent the most dangerous parts of the proposal. From techdirt.com, forget the GDPR, the EU's new copyright proposal will be a complete and utter disaster for the internet. Believe it or not, there's an even larger threat from the EU looming, and it's received precious little attention. The EU's new copyright reform proposal is set to be voted on next month, and it will truly be disastrous to the internet. As it currently stands, it will require widespread censorship in the form of mandatory filtering and also link taxes that have already been shown to be harmful to news. Have you got a license for that link, mate? European Parliament member Julia Reda is sounding the alarm and asking people to speak out. As she notes, many of the folks now freaking out about the GDPR wish they got involved over 2 years ago when it was being debated. And if you're concerned about how problematic this new copyright reform will be for the internet, now is the time to speak out. Yes, even if you're not in the EU. I love how we only have less than a month to do anything about this. It's almost like that was deliberate. Please explain to me why we need the EU again. Oh yeah, because without them we wouldn't have a centralized authoritarian bureaucracy to control our lives. I forgot about that. On the topic of copyright, you now have the chance to have an influence. A chance that will be long lost in 2 years, when we'll all be suddenly faced with the challenge of having to implement upload filters and the link tax, or running into new limits on what we can do using the web services we rely on. In stark contrast to the GDPR, experts near unanimously agree that the copyright reform law as it stands now is really bad. Where in the case of the GDPR, the EU institutions pushed through many changes against the concerted lobbying efforts of big business interests, in the copyright reform, they are about to give them exactly what they want. Parliament and Council have had over a year and a half to fix the glaring flaws of the Commission proposal, but despite their growing complexity, the latest drafts of both institutions fail to meet basic standards of workability and proportionability. Initially, they may have wanted to implement this Article 13 in order to clamp down on piracy, people downloading and re-uploading whole movies and TV shows in their entirety, which is fair enough. Obviously, that's outright copyright infringement. But this is different. This would encompass everything else as well, including fair use. There would literally be a tax for linking to other websites to use as sources and references in news blogs and videos. Content, including videos, would be filtered through some kind of Content ID copyright system in order to detect materials that belong to someone else. I should point out this would, of course, destroy current existing copyright fair use laws, rendering them useless. You wouldn't be able to comment on or respond to footage you didn't own, even in a transformative fair use situation. Currently, it's legal to use copyrighted footage as long as it's used for commentary, critique, parody, news reporting, or some kind of transformative fashion, like those hilarious YouTube remix music videos you love so much. This new EU article would take all of that off the table. Retta's post goes on to detail the many, many problems of the current copyright proposal, in which merely linking to a news site may require paying money, link tax, and where concerns about how that might negatively impact the entire internet are being woefully ignored. Perhaps even worse is the mandatory filtering idea. The big record labels and movie studios have, of course, been pushing for this kind of thing for years to get back at Google mainly and Facebook a little bit. But here's the thing, both Google and Facebook already have those filters and spent tens of millions of dollars on them. This kind of law fucks over everyone else. And it's actually even worse than a mandatory filtering rule because the EU realized that such a rule would violate other EU laws. So instead, it decided to hack away at intermediary liability protections to make mandatory filtering necessary, make platforms directly liable for all copyright infringements, and then offer that they can avoid that unreasonable liability if they can show they've done everything in their power to prevent copyrighted content from appearing online, namely by deploying upload filters, Article 30, Paragraph 4, which remain totally optional. Of course, wink wink nudge nudge. Tragically, the only remaining point of disagreement in Council is whether this proposal is bad enough or should be made worse. In other words, if the likes of YouTube, Facebook, and other such websites were to be made liable for every piece of content uploaded to their platform, they would obviously not take the risk of having to pay the extortionate copyright and linking fees involved. So they'd have to use filters to prevent those videos from being uploaded in the first place. Every alternative news media content creator and company you subscribe to and watch on a regular basis would be eliminated online because they would no longer be allowed to make fair use of a few seconds or minutes of video footage belonging to another person, or even just include a link to where they sourced a news story or information related to what they're talking about in the video without paying some kind of link tax. Can you see how ridiculously insane this proposal is? It almost sounds like something being pushed by the mainstream media in order to force the EU to make consuming alternative news media impossible, and thus completely control what people see and read online. We've already spent years explaining how this will lead to widespread censorship online, but it will also be a disaster for basically all of the non-Google Facebook platforms out there. Mid-sized companies like GitHub have already talked about how this could effectively destroy its ability to operate, and lots of other sites would be impacted as well. Any kind of forum site would be at serious risk. Reddit, Pinterest, Twitch, Imgur, WordPress, Medium, Vimeo. This would create massive liability for all those sites, making it nearly impossible for many of them to function in the EU. This would also include your own personal WordPress blog, but also new social networks like Minds, Gab, and BitChute. None of those sites could operate. If you happen to be among the minority of people who voted no in the Brexit referendum, voting to stay in the EU, take your right hand and smack yourself in the face. Mr. Voss' latest draft expands the scope of the censorship machine's proposal to all web platforms whose purpose is to give access to copyrighted content uploaded by users, that's very vague, and which optimize that content. What counts as optimizing? Well, presumably they're talking about fair use there. Among a long list of actions, we find that displaying the uploads already makes platforms legally liable for any copyright infringement that may include... Oh my God. So, in other words, if a blog website links to copyrighted material, I mean, they're liable for that. It's unbelievable. And in his version, web services can't even avoid liability by implementing upload filters. To protect themselves from being sued, they would need to get licenses. Here we go. Have you got a license for that? They need to get licenses from all rights holders that exist on the planet. That's not unworkable. Before allowing user uploads to go online, just in case the upload may contain parts of any of their works. Yeah. That would make it impossible to work. Fair use permits people to use portions of copyrighted works without asking permission, so long as it's used in the manner I stated earlier: commentary, analysis, parody, news, etc. The idea that you'd have to obtain permission from every person on the planet who has footage you want to use would make news reporting impossible, obviously, outside of the mainstream media, who have the means, the financial resources, and connections to do so. As Retta points out, most of the EU member states appear to be supportive of these horrible ideas. Why am I not surprised? Or pushing to make them worse. What now stands between this horrible law making a mess of the internet is just the EU Parliament, which... This is why we can't have nice things. The EU Parliament is currently scheduled to vote on this in late June, probably the 20th or 21st. If you are in the EU now, is absolutely the time to speak up. If you're outside the EU, we also need you to speak up, because this is just going to absolutely destroy everything. Free speech, innovation, like they say, The free and open internet will be gone. I have seen some scary internet proposals from various governments in my time, but I cannot believe that this was born purely out of technical ignorance or bureaucratic incompetence. It's simply too destructive to free speech and will hand over all the power to large corporate media forever. It's not an exaggeration to say that this will destroy the internet. There is a petition website where you can go and register your protest to this proposal. It's saveyourinternet.eu. Even if you're not in the EU, we still need your help. There's a little rolling GIF here that shows numerous examples of the kinds of things that are under threat from this Article 13. Commenting, making parody content, your personal blog, sharing certain content, remixing content, creating memes, live streaming, and of course linking. Anything that could potentially contain links or some materials that the user does not own, including the work of artists. Basically all of the things that make the internet fun, creative, and interesting. What's really concerning is that very few people are talking about this because very few people actually know anything about it. It's kind of like GDPR. It kind of crept up on a lot of businesses without them fully being prepared for it. You can call your local MEP if you're in the EU and complain. We need to make an enormous amount of noise about this on social media with emails, petitions, videos, blog posts, meetings with politicians if possible. Do whatever you can. Otherwise, we're going to wake up in a world someday where it's going to be, have you got a license for that blog, mate?